All right, hello, everyone. It is 3 p.m., so I will call the Monday, April 4th, 2022 Design Review Committee meeting to order. And for the record, I can see that committee members Gresham and Hurd are here online, and we know that committee member Labrie will not be joining us today. And at City Hall, we have planner Hanna Veal and Jenah Thornborrow. Are there any changes to the agenda? By staff. And then we'll move on to the consent agenda consisting of the March 21st, 2022 meeting minutes.
I didn't see any issues and I'll move to approve.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, we only have one item on the agenda today, and that's a discussion of revisions provided by Hanna Veal for file number CPA fiscal year 2022 number 1, a proposal to amend code to allow for tiny home communities and tiny homes as accessory dwelling. There was a revised staff report that went out that does show the revised changes in blue with an analysis with additional comments in blue as well. And this is an informal work session, so we can delve right in unless the committee members want a presentation from the applicant. Looks like no, and so let's just delve in to the changes and comments, suggestions, etc.
Jenna, are you starting with us?
Because this is an informal work session, we're going to just jump right in.
Gotcha.
See if they can pull up this tiny home
So,
text amendment.
Jenna, I just had a note. Just wanted to say, obviously, thank you for design committee and staff for reviewing this again. And all we had was we wanted to provide specific time to the committee to really analyze those sections of code, that verbiage very specifically. And then we had a couple points, explanation and clarification to staff's recent staff report. And then as well as we wanted to just explain that document and how we're compiling this feedback. And so each work session, how we're installing the comments and how this is really a working document to really change or modify those very specific sections that we originally submitted. So can the committee members open the final link? It says the staff report or the amendment?
No, listen.
It says text code amendment.
Tiny home code text amendment,
Yeah.
0224.
Second from the bottom.
Yeah.
Yep, second from the bottom.
Yep, got it.
So I think that's what we kind of want to go through. That's really what the staff responded to. And what we did was we formatted this in kind of a more comparative nature, because the way we wrote it before, it was just the code and you really didn't get to look at other Garden City code. And I think part of the initial comments from staff were, hey, this needs to read more like Garden City code, so that it feels like it was written as part of this. So what we did was we kind of just made some modifications to our other code. I think the staff also pointed out that maybe some of the stuff that we had in there was maybe extracurricular and not necessary. So what we did was we kind of, one of the things we heard in the previous work sessions, because we did work sessions with design review, planning and zoning, and city council. So I know throughout that process, one of the things we heard was effectively, is that us, Sharon? Oh, there you go. One of the things we heard was that, hey, maybe this is already legal as an RV park, meaning in theory, you can put RVIA certified tiny homes into an RV park, and technically your tiny home community is already an allowed use in Garden City. Now, I think what we see is that maybe technically by code that's true, but in theory, because of the limitations that the city has placed on RV parks, one of the main ones being that there's a 3-acre minimum, it doesn't really fit what other places are doing for tiny home communities, which are in general much smaller than 3 acres. And I think it defeats the purpose of being tiny. And again, I'm not sure why the city code requires a 3-acre minimum for an RV park, but in much of the city where I think the tiny home communities would be allowed, like, so for example, in my neighborhood, the blocks are only 2 2/3 acres in size. So my entire city block isn't actually 3 acres. And so even though by zoning an RV park would be allowed, in reality, even if you owned every property on the entire block, an RV park isn't allowed because it would be too small. And so I think, like I said, when we look at it, if Garden City is going to allow for tiny homes, then we think there should be, because I do believe they're different than RVs, and the appeal of them is different than RVs. Like I said, if you look, there's TV shows about tiny homes. And part of the reason that is because there is an appeal. And it really is different than RVs. When you watch Tiny Home Nation, they're not showing people living in RVs. They're showing people living in tiny homes because there's a certain appeal to that. So we do believe there's a need for having a separate code from RVs to tiny homes, even though there's an obvious relationship between the two.
And so we brought in some characteristics from that RV code, but we essentially designed this, and that's what we really wanted to go through. So thank you, Derek, for pulling that up.
And so I think let's kind of start with the first thing. So one of the first comments from staff in our previous application was the need for registration. Now, I'll point out that the RV park code doesn't require RVs to be registered in Garden City. So we really didn't have anything to base the registration of the tiny homes on, and we weren't really sure what the city's intent of recommending that they be registered was.
It was a comment that came up from staff, so we wanted to start introducing that verbiage because staff said it could be appropriate to have a registration. So we were almost kind of not putting a placeholder, but putting something that we thought staff might want to see as far as registration. And then staff had mentioned that maybe what was the intent? Was it coming from the state of Idaho? And it wasn't that it was coming from the state of Idaho, it was coming from staff. So we wanted to just start introducing that. So kind of wanted to hear from committee and staff on thoughts on that registration section.
Yeah, and I'll jump in because a flash crossed on my mind about maybe Garden City doesn't require RVs to be registered, but they have to be registered under the state to like be on the road, to be towed and go to and from. And when they're doing their temporary move every 90 days or whatever, it needs to be licensed and registered and insured, I would imagine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that I think tiny houses, that same fact applies, meaning all tiny houses have to be licensed.
Street legal.
Meaning
It's got a little license
trailer that
plate.
they're built
Yeah,
on is
yeah.
licensed as a trailer, and it has to be street legal. It has to meet the size requirements to be towed on the road. So I don't think there's an actual difference there. Again, I'm not sure why Garden City would want to see the registration, but we kind of thought maybe, part of it is maybe there's some use in tracking what vehicles are being parked in Garden City and lived in case there, maybe through that information, we might see problems in the future and be able to adjust appropriately before, there's an actual issue.
Yeah, I can see, and I mean, you see it in the city of Boise right now. They have legislation to register your short-term rental. So it's kind of
Right.
like the
Sure.
same, like, it's
Sure.
like, we want to know what's going on, basically, I think is the
Yeah. And
long and
that's-
short of it.
Derek, I agree. I saw the registration being a tracking of how many do we have? Where are they being parked? What, just the data essentially, not necessarily the street legal component, because I think that's, absolutely can be in that document, but really saying how many do we have? Where are they parked? What's the criteria? Where are they being lived in? And just again, a method for tracking. And again, happy to have that in there, and maybe staff can speak to what they specifically, I don't know what they wanted to see. Sorry, I'm trying to read from a distance.
Well, and I think, I think the only other thing that was maybe mentioned by staff is maybe looking at penalties if they aren't registered. And we can certainly add that. Maybe it can be an infraction on the first offense, and then there can be some penalties, and make sure that we put the responsibility for the actual owners of the community to make sure those get registered.
Yeah.
I think staff also had a comment of why we had the 14 days. And I think it's because maybe tiny homes could be moved on initially, and then it would give them a 2-week period to get registered. Which I think is adequate, because I think current city code actually allows occupancy of recreational vehicles for up to 14 days per year without any penalty. But maybe Jenah or Hanna, whoever's there, can comment on that. So we were really putting that in to match up with the current code that already exists.
So I'll answer. I think there's quite a bit of things that can be done through registration. It's almost like there's two separate things that are being looked at through registration, both the roadworthiness, I would say, that state registration, the licensing, the insurance. So that's kind of one piece of it. And then the second is community, the tiny home community activities. So as this is proposed, it's a permitted use. So there would be no permits that would come through that I see, right? It's just, there are regulations, but who's overseeing that? Is it code enforcement driving around? Is it the community owner enforcing, making sure that the provisions are being met? Because there are provisions, but then there's no permitting elsewhere. So is it the licensing that people are adhering to the timeframes, adhering to the provisions, et cetera? And so there's really two different things there. And then if you're having a community, the question there going, should those that are in the community register when they get to the community, or is that intending to be for those that are parking in front of grandma's house?
Yeah.
And so it's almost like two different registration types are melded into one.
So Jenah, can we ask a question kind of on your thoughts? I know you say like, hey, there's no, it's just an allowed use. What would you propose? Let's say we wanted it to go like through staff, or maybe for even some of the, I think, we kind of tried to add some regulations for at least the street fronting tiny homes, so that they meet kind of the idea of Garden City Code and addressing the street. I mean, is that something that we should add so that it goes through design review?
Well, there are different things. So a lot of the uses that are permitted end up coming through this body. So say a multifamily use is permitted, but it goes through a design review to look at the provisions to make sure that it's being met. Some permit types are staff driven or staff reviewed, and that's all set up in the code in the administrative side of things. And so there could be additional provisions added to the administrative, but right now there's no nothing proposed in your proposal.
So Jenna, would you support, I mean, is that a I kind of read it, but I want to make sure that you're saying, so you think there maybe should be some things added to the administrative side so that this would be addressed by staff?
Personally, I do think that having a community would be something that could benefit from having a review.
Yeah.
You know, if you're adding a fence, it's either on, it's meeting a certain height or not, it's of a certain materials or not. So like a code enforcement's pretty easy to oversee that sort of things if they find one that's out of compliance. Whereas this, in my opinion, is a more in-depth proposal.
Sure. Now, I guess my question, and this is the question that we kind of have, because it, obviously, I think it could be a conditional use, but as we talked about it being a conditional use, it seems like, in my mind, our real goal right now is to lay out the conditions that we would want up front, because, I think in our mind, we'd like to get all the conditions that the city wants right now so that it could be a permitted use. But we certainly want it to have oversight, because we do think transparency through that process is important. And so you would suggest just like simply adding that tiny homes and tiny home communities would be something to go through staff level and possibly even design review?
I would think that that's something that goes through the policy decisions, right?
Okay.
But I would think, and I'd love feedback from the committee, but to me, a design review would be appropriate because where's your open space and your amenities, et cetera? Are you actually hitting the mark there? And then whether or not it's a conditional use, is it strictly appropriate in all locations? Are there locations where it may or may not be appropriate? And so a conditional use would be appropriate in that instance.
Yeah, I think that if you think about, let's just say 20 tiny homes on a acre, just to pick two numbers, there's a lot going on there, and therefore there's a lot that could go wrong there too, right? I mean, it could be a wall of the side of 5 tiny homes facing the street with no relationships to the street and just a courtyard on the interior, and that would not be, beneficial to the community at large. So I think just some input through whatever, if it's staff level or design review level, planning and zoning level, some review of that just to make sure it's kind of contributing to the overall fabric.
Is it, and I'm just thinking out loud, so is it fair to say that communities, so once a tiny house community is established, not only will staff be involved, naturally, of course, but then the community will return to a design review for further design guidance?
Similar to what we would do for a subdivision.
Perfect.
I mean, in a way.
Gotcha. No, that's understandable. And then that second part for registration is, so it's twofold. So we need basically to track or have a mechanism, document, whatever that is, to understand their street legal. Secondly, to, I think, have the community owner / landowner within 14 days turn in a document that X unit will be parked in X community. And then additionally, the community, once a tiny house community is established, it then goes through staff level / design review body. That's kind of what I'm hearing. Those three things need to start.
I think your community layout is gonna be ahead of all of that, right? It's like, hey, here's our open space, here's X number of units on this site, here's where our
Right.
common drive is, that sort of stuff.
Okay.
Before you start saying, here's the houses, here's the houses that are going in it.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Okay.
Let me go through. So I want to kind of clarify a little bit. We are proposing this in the C2 and R3 zone. And I want to make sure, because in the staff report, I think there's a couple things said that maybe aren't 100% clear. So I think the first thing is that there are no tiny home communities already in Idaho, or that tiny homes aren't allowed anywhere else in the state. And I don't think that is true. So I think when we reviewed where tiny homes exist in Idaho, they actually exist in a lot of places. There are a couple of cities that have already legalized tiny homes on wheels, which is really what we're doing. We're saying tiny homes, but I do want to make sure that it's clear that our definition of tiny homes is the original definition of tiny homes, which is actually a tiny home on wheels. Now, I think more recently, people are referring to tiny homes as just small houses that have been foundationed, but a lot of that has come about because lots of places you can't have the original tiny homes on wheels because they're not technically legal. But so, for example, the city of Moscow has legalized tiny homes on wheels. Blaine County has legalized tiny homes on wheels. We know that Elmore County allows tiny homes on wheels in both mobile home parks and in RV parks. And so I think what we did was we looked at the code and we said, okay, Elmore County says, hey, you can have tiny homes on wheels already. You can only put them in mobile home parks and RV parks. In Garden City, there are 2 locations where mobile home parks and RV parks are allowed, and those are the C2 and R3 zoning. So we proposed those zones because I feel like it's a safe bet to have it there. So I think because other counties and other cities are basically allowing it in those same zoning types, and they haven't revoked their tiny home approval, it's kind of safe for us as we look at the C2 and R3 zoning. Trailer parks already exist pretty prolifically in the R3, and tiny homes are really just really small versions that stay much more mobile and are easier to move than a trailer, but they're effectively kind of a trendy version of the same thing. And same thing as the RV parks. Those RV parks are allowed in the C2 zone. And tiny homes in many cases are classified as RVs so that they're able to be parked in RV parks so that they can meet the requirements that RV parks would allow them to be there, because their size is actually similar to many RVs.
And when we did some research, we found that nothing in Idaho code, or from the Idaho's perspective, would not allow cities specifically to have the jurisdiction and authority to allow them in zones that they choose. So that was what our review was, that state of Idaho is allowing the cities to dictate where they're being parked. And so therefore, by adopting this code, it wouldn't be, our review was not that the state of Idaho would have any concerns as long as it's Garden City's process.
Yeah. Well, and I also think that there was some suggestion in the staff report that maybe this might not be legal, but I do think tiny homes are legal in Idaho. I don't think there's no city that's been shut down from their allowing of tiny homes. So it's really up to Garden City to define what they're comfortable with. I think, we look at it and we say Garden City's comfortable enough to have RV parks, and here's the requirements for these RV parks. We think tiny home is a better solution because, as we know, the RV parks, like a great example is the Expo Idaho site, that the Riverfront RV park there on Ada County property. It operates pretty much as a long-term living space for people who are in RVs. And so we kind of think like, well, if there were a little tiny home community that was kind of an in-between solution, it wasn't people living in RVs, it would maybe fit in better with Garden City than an RV park. And so maybe this is something that Garden City should be looking at now, City of Boise is currently actually doing a prototype, and they're allowing a number of tiny houses in people's backyards, and they're going to actually have a couple of smaller, like maybe 3 and 4 tiny home communities that they're testing, and they'll be doing that, I think, for the next year.
So back to code, sorry guys, so when we introduced where these would be located, we found that R3 and C2 was the most appropriate areas, right? I mean, obviously R1, if you introduced this in an R1 zone, it may have some conflict with the adjoining neighbors. So we selected again, where currently mobile home parks exist for the locations.
Well, and keep going. I'm going to keep going down through this code.
But again, we definitely want to hear from you guys on thoughts.
Well, before you go back up, Derek, I just want to address the semi-permanent. I think we're okay saying temporary if the city wants us to say temporary. I think what we'd like to see the city express is, so for example, on Ada County's property, they allow RVs to stay for 6 months at a time. So the question is, what's a good time limit to still be temporary so that we make sure the tiny homes stay mobile and that they're able to be moved easily? Because I do think that's one of the prime advantages of tiny homes on wheels that they have over trailers, is that people can have ownership of them and know that they actually own them. Oftentimes if you own a trailer, but it's sitting on somebody else's property, you don't really own it, because the cost to move those becomes prohibitive. And so I think, in our mind, something closer to a year or 2 years as a time frame for when they need to be moved to basically exhibit mobility is more appropriate, so that the community isn't so transient. But again, we kind of need the city to start to weigh in on their thoughts, so that we can have a timeline. Again, I think when we say semi-permanent, we're really still saying temporary, but not as temporary as every 3 months. The truth of the definition of tiny homes is they're not meant to be moved often. They're stick built. They're not aerodynamic like an actual RV would be. So when they design, teardrop trailers, they're designed to be aerodynamic, but tiny homes are not. They're really not meant to be moved often. They can be moved. But that's, I think, something we'd like to hear maybe you and Maureen weigh in on, is kind of what you think would be an appropriate timeline for exhibiting the fact that they are still mobile. Because I do think that's really how cities meet Idaho code to say, hey, this isn't a permanent structure.
And in this section, it's talking about short or long-term, temporary or permanent. Why? I guess I'm questioning why we define short-term and what this timeline is. If, why can't something permanent just be moved? Is there a code that's saying if you put a tiny house on this site and you're saying it's permanent, what then prevents it from being moved later?
Well, to answer your question,
I'm questioning.
I'll try to answer that question, Derek. So here's what I think has kind of happened. So Idaho law says that things that are recreational vehicles have to be kind of temporary, right? They're not actually permanent, effectively. So I think it says they're meant for vacation and recreation and emergency uses, but they're not permanent. So there's this implied idea. So the way cities have effectively proven that it's not permanent has been to make RVs move. So for example, current Garden City Code makes an RV move every 3 months. So if we had an RV park, every 3 months, an RV would have to move. In my mind, what we're trying to do with a tiny home community, maybe the city still has a need to try to meet Idaho code to say, look, these are still mobile structures. They are not foundationed. They are still movable structures that aren't permanent. And that'll allow them to meet that Idaho code. But at the same time, I think our hope is that, like I said, the truth is the state doesn't put a timeline on that requirement. There's no state requirement that says you got to move every 3 months. Garden City decided that. Ada County says it's every 6 months. Now Moscow has literally put a no limit on it. They say, look, you don't have to move it. We just have to know that it's able to be moved.
Right. And
Right.
so the
So-
only reason to put short-termness and movability in this is to still be able to call it an RV, which is movable.
Not necessarily to call it an RV, but I think Idaho code hasn't defined tiny homes separately yet.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So they need to fit in some category under Idaho code so that cities are okay. And like I said, I don't even think, like I said, Moscow, their current code doesn't actually even require you to move it. It just requires that it still be movable
Mobile.
Right.
in short notice.
Right.
And they just put that in the code and said, hey, as long as you think you can move it or you can prove
Yeah.
that you can move it, then so the question really comes down to what's Garden City's preference. Now,
Right.
our preference is, like I said, to try to prevent the transientness of a RV park. Like if you have all these RVs moving every 3 months, when we all know that this is going to be a more permanent solution. Just like I said, if you went to Expo Idaho and you talk to the people who are there on site, every single person you talk to has been there for 6 months.
Yeah.
And then they simply move off and then move back on. And so it's an interesting thing that they really are living there, but then they're doing what they need to do to meet code.
So
So the real
I have a
question-
suggestion that, I
Yeah.
mean, for me, I don't think, unless the city has a different opinion, and I would like to hear it, I don't know that there needs to be a time limit.
And I would suggest that if the applicant is hoping that there isn't a time limit, that they just note in the criteria for the communities that they have to be movable and roadworthy in short time. So
Yeah.
criteria, you can't take off the wheels, you have to keep it
Yeah.
licensed.
And I like those sideboards, Jenna, and again,
Yeah, but
yeah,
has to stay licensed.
yep, I like to stay, and then, again, stay licensed, stay mobile. Do not
And then-
remove, keep it in operable moving order. I like those sideboards for sure. Do not remove
Well,
chassis.
and
axle.
I'll say my only argument where I kind of thought maybe from the city's perspective is by having them have to move, even if it's a long term, like every 5 years, it does give the city a chance to review code during that time so that, let's say there's something comes on to these tiny home communities that the city doesn't like,
Sure,
when they get moved off, the city can go, hey, we've adopted this new code now. That thing that we didn't like is fixed.
sure.
I again, don't want to, I mean, one of the reasons for having tiny homes is more of an affordable option. If you make someone have to move 3 months, 1 year, 5 years, you're kind of taking away that affordability, in my opinion. So it needs to be movable.
Sure. And I like personally, I like those tight timelines. It needs to stay street legal at all times. They need to maintain all their street legal. They need to keep it in appropriate movable condition at all times, to include air and tires. Chassis, axles, and tongue need to stay in appropriate working order. I like those sideboards. And then again, I like longer time because I want to exhibit that community feel. I want it to feel very welcoming, very clean, very safe, very know your neighbors. But again, keep those units ready to be in tow.
So Jenna, so obviously one of our things is really just a language issue on how we want to address whether it's a temporary use or whether we, obviously I see you guys don't like semi-permanent because it's not defined. We have a couple options there, which we could define semi-permanent in Garden City Code if we wanted to. Is that an option, or do you feel like that would be something, or we should just continue to maybe just say it's a temporary so that it kind of meets up with what Idaho code already reads?
Well, Jason, so staff's suggestion was just to get rid of the short-term, long-term, temporary, permanent for the definition and add a tiny home on wheels community is the use of a site by two or more tiny homes on wheels.
Yep.
And then have the provisions that talk about how those communities work, perhaps having provisions such as 90 days, 180 days, or movable, or however that works through.
Yeah.
But if
Okay.
you do keep long-term, temporary, permanent, all of that, I do think it needs to be defined.
Got it.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was kind of suggesting and questioning, and I never articulated it very well, is if you're saying for short or long term, that's pretty much everything. If you're saying temporary or permanent, that's pretty much everything.
Yeah.
So by saying everything, you're saying nothing, so just take it out.
Yeah. So we'll
Yes.
remove that. That's good.
And I like how Jenna said 90, 100 or movable has to be clearly defined. And that goes back to Maureen's point. It has to have all those mechanisms to say, tires, working operable condition, working operable condition, axles and chassis, working operable condition, units must be ready to stay in tow, or that verbiage. I like that.
Yeah, we can work on that.
Okay.
As you
So
scroll
then,
up,
just one quick point, because I like to go all the way to the nth degree and think about that. Like, if you're requiring them to be mobile at all times, have wheel, have air in the tires, that sort of thing, then what if down the road, for whatever reason, someone wanted it to be permanent, to put it on a foundation, to subdivide it and make a bunch of tiny home lots that someone could actually get a mortgage on and a loan on?
Sure.
Like, is that, are you painting yourself into a corner?
well, I
and-
think,
and-
Derek, I would say we would love that. I think the bigger issue is maybe the city isn't ready for that.
But is that also not, you could
But
start
that's
from
not a
scratch.
tiny home community.
You could start from scratch
Right.
and make a community of many tiny homes
Yeah.
on foundations.
Well, and so what I would
right?
say, Derek, is I think you can already do that now.
Yeah, okay, that's what I was thinking.
In other words, right now, there's really nothing in the code that prevents you from building homes on foundations. And,
Right.
and like in our neighborhood, in this live work, those homes can be as small as I think 220 square feet.
Right.
So they're really even smaller than the tiny homes on wheels we're proposing in
Right.
theory. And there's nothing that actually prevents you from already doing it on a foundation in the code. So I think that's why we're not really addressing that, because I think it's already allowed.
I think it's the
It could be
mobility component that's the harder.
Yeah, I think when people invented tiny homes and they got all this publicity, it was actually always tiny homes on wheels. And it's only really recently in the last few years where more and more tiny homes on foundations have also been getting attention, because lots of places don't allow the tiny homes on wheels.
Their code isn't written for it.
Right. So I think already it's allowed on a foundation, which is why we're not addressing that.
Got
But
it.
Derek, I can see that there's like a mechanism to say, we don't want one person to pop their unit off and then have kind of like a hodgepodge of chassis, or does it? Again, I'm just trying to think into the future. So
Well, and I think if the city decided they wanted to allow
they'd have to go.
subdivision, we
through the
could come back to
permit.
this code
Yeah.
and change it. But I just think maybe it's too, we're not even allowing tiny houses on wheels yet.
Yeah.
Let alone going into the weeds of, hey,
Yeah.
are we going to be able to subdivide this? And then I can buy the land under just my little tiny house on wheels. So I think maybe that's too far, too quick.
Yep.
For this city, but I do think that it should be something that is possible. Now what I would also say, and I think what I see as maybe another option that is available so people could own the land under their tiny homes is what's already happened in Garden City, which is the
Essentially,
resident-owned community.
co-op or even a condo plat might work.
Well, the resident-owned communities happen now to 2 trailer parks in Garden City, where you don't own specific land because the whole community owns the land, but it allows you to then have your plat of land within that community. And so I think that's an easier thing that would already be allowed under here, that would allow like a by owner
Cooperative.
Yeah.
cooperative. And then you wouldn't also run into the issues because some of these tiny homes are only 200 square feet. So like, by the code we've written, I think there's some details in there, but the actual sites are maybe like in some case, like 2,000 square feet of space. Now, in our mind, that's because we want these to be kind of really trendier communities with more open space, maybe some more common area. So we don't want them to feel crowded like trailer parks.
Sure, not at all.
But it doesn't mean in the future that couldn't be changed.
And specifically from this body, I mean, I'd love to hear design ideas. I know after attending so many meetings, I understand that street activation is critical. Open space is critical, amenities. I would even say this body really looks at, how is trash being used and screened and picked up. I mean, it's those design aesthetics. And I don't want to jump us, but my big thing is outdoor storage. That's my personal.
Yeah, that's all the way at the end.
Okay,
Just
so
wait for that.
let's not go there.
Well, let's go through. I think we're
Okay.
going to obviously make a bunch of changes. If you look here, the biggest part of the staff comments were on the definition of tiny home. And so we'll obviously address all the things here. I actually like that so I do believe right now the American National Standards Institute is actually working on tiny home on wheels specific code. And there's already IBC code for tiny homes on foundations. It doesn't technically apply to tiny homes on wheels yet, but most people who are building tiny homes on wheels right now, so most construction companies are either building them to those IBC standards, even though they technically don't apply to tiny homes on wheels, or they're building them to RVIA standards. Now, I think as we talk through the first work sessions, there's confusion on how RVIA works. So you don't actually build to RVIA standards. It's not like you can build something and then take it and get it inspected and get an RVIA certificate. The way RVIA works is builders go through training and they take a test that says, I meet
And
RVIA
I will adhere
certification.
to
And then
these standards.
everything they build is then RVIA certified. So in order to be RVIA,
The builder has to.
you have to be a builder that's building a lot of things. Otherwise, it's not worth your time. But the RVIA standards actually do come from the American National Standard Institute. Whoops. Are we still on? Can everybody hear us?
We can hear you. We can't see you. Just Ollie.
Here we go. We're back. So that's kind of a little bit of that. But like I said, I think we're going to work on that definition so that maybe it's a little simpler and kind of we'll move some things around so that maybe some of the 400 square foot is actually part of a dimensional requirement instead of just being in there.
Well, can we not say street legal, which then puts the burden of proof on DMV to say it has to fit on a lane? Street legal has a definition.
Well, I think it already has to be because they're on
Okay.
trailers. I mean, we
Well-
could, I think in our registration thing. We already
Sure.
say that it has to be licensed.
Okay,
that-
/ street legal, or is that not the
I
verbiage?
don't think that's.
Okay, let's
necessary.
say licensed through DMV, because then it'll be triggered to be street. legal.
Well, I don't think we already have it up
Okay.
above. So moving down, I think there's a bunch of suggestions. Like I said, you can kind of see, I think it's like close to 1,500 square feet and 2,000 square feet per site. Now, this is something we do need kind of some comment on. So when we look at tiny home communities, one of the interesting things that I like about them is that they don't feel like trailer parks. And so I think when we did this dimensional analysis, so if you were to look at the recreational vehicle park, it basically says every space has to have 700 square feet. And so it says, hey, you have to make spaces, specific spaces for each RV. And those spaces have to be 700 square feet. So what we did was we said, look, we want to kind of make this tiny home community more flexible. So instead of having specific spaces, we thought it would be better to just put a density that effectively limits the space. And you can see it does limit the space. But really, in a way, makes it where there's some flexibility, because when I think of a tiny home, you know, some of, like, I think even in we had a PowerPoint that we put before city council, and in some of that PowerPoint, some of the coolest little communities, sometimes like one guy had two tiny houses. One was his little artist workspace and the other was his actual house.
Oh,
And he
sure.
set them side by side to each other. So they kind of made an L.
Yeah, they did make it now.
And then he had a stage set up where he could play music, and they had a picture of all the people out listening to his little band playing. But the idea was, look, if we have code that says, oh, that the tiny homes each have to be on their own separate lot, then you won't have the flexibility to create kind of this more interesting community space. While still, like I said, we're still limiting how many units are going to be on the property, but not saying how they have to be arranged.
I like the idea of having flexibility. However, I also have concerns about minimum, or maybe we should be looking at minimum or maximum distances between different homes, just for fire and safety and health. So maybe kind of approach it from that angle, but I agree. I like the flexibility.
Well, and Maureen, I thought about that too. And I guess here would be my argument. So my argument would be that each tiny house is really just a bedroom, right? I mean, it's like such a small space. Like in a normal home, it would be a bedroom. And so it's like an interesting thing, because if you say, okay, well, we want 10 feet between each tiny home, in a way, you're like literally saying these bedrooms can't be near each other. But in a normal house, you would have your bedrooms right next to each other without any fire protection whatsoever, and nobody would be worried about it. Now, I get that maybe.
Well, yeah, but you're talking about two different things. You're talking about two people or two homes, different potentially people owning those homes. I think one of them would get upset having them right up against your bedroom if your bedroom caught on fire and theirs caught on fire.
Sure.
So, I mean, so that's not, I'm not saying 10 feet, but
Yeah.
just some kind of fire standard.
Sure.
You know, something
Well,
for health and safety.
And I guess our question would be, what do you guys think
Yeah.
is a reasonable distance? I mean, obviously, if you look at the NeighborWorks projects, they're putting their stuff 5 feet apart. Is that adequate to feel like, hey, this is protected?
I have a question for staff on that. The 5 feet, are there any special fire related requirements on building? Because if not, then I would be totally fine with 5 feet.
There are fire regulations, and I think it's 6 feet. So
Okay.
you'll see the codes where it's 3 feet and 3 feet between property lines. And then with additional fire rating, you got to get closer, and Derek may know better off the top of his head.
Oh, but I'm
as
reaching
I'm
6
misspeaking.
feet to see that.
But then I do know in the manufactured and mobile home park regulations, the distance between units is 20 feet with an allowance provided the fire department allows for the allowance to 15. So I don't know if in fire code, there's something that would be different than building code for different types of structures.
Yeah, and I mean, in RV parks, is there a distance you have to park away from your neighbor in an RV park? So I think, and I'm fine, as Maureen said, like 5 feet seems fine, whatever that kind of code minimum is, feels fine. And in all practicality, like the residents may not want to be 2 feet from each other. They might want to
Sure.
be a certain distance from each other. And it may feel more natural that 10 feet is right, but I don't think we need to say it has to be something greater than a code minimum.
Agreed.
Can you angle that a little bit? Yeah, and then again, I
Well, you
think,
can see it here.
oh, gotcha.
It's like, I'm just matching it.
I think, yeah,
Well, and that's really it. I mean, I think,
especially if we're going to be returning these communities to a DR, we wanted some, I don't want to say flexibility, but we definitely want DR to put their input on that design and that layout. And what I found is if it's absolutely too rigid and dimensional, it will naturally and organically be designed like a
RV park.
RV
Right,
or a
right.
mobile home park. Because if you're saying space drop, space drop, space drop, you know, and I really want to emphasize the community aspect, right? I really want to put those open spaces in that community and those very nice features that have not been installed into RV parks and to mobile home parks.
And so, Jenna, so obviously we'll add a section of stuff that puts some sort of minimum distance so that we can get some comment on that. And what we'll also do is look at what the current RV regulations are, even though there's no real standard there. We'll look at some RV parks and see how they park those. You know, obviously, having been to like Expo, Idaho, they're pretty close.
I mean, I think we could put a minimum.
Well, and I think it, you know, if we're saying maybe it's 6 for neighbor work stuff, I mean, the thing that I see is that these buildings are like movable, meaning if your neighbor's thing catches on fire and you wake up in the night and see it, you don't have to leave your house there. It can be moved.
But to contradict that, there's not the parking for the vehicle to move it. So you wouldn't have a vehicle to do so necessarily.
Well, so just to comment to how we'll be moving these, I think we'll actually have trailer dollies. They're like trailer valets. That's how we plan on moving them into the site to kind of maximize space.
Yeah, those are actually the most user-friendly. And like, again, I think it is a good idea to always have one on site. They're
We'll have a couple.
affordable, but I mean, they're really kind of easy to maneuver the units with those being on site.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm actually in favor of having it on site, because then you get into the issue of screening it. Is it outdoor storage? What does it look like? Let's
Well,
just
what do you-
go
what do you
with
mean?
minimum of
Trailer
3
dolly.
feet per,
So the
which is
trailer
a total
valet
of
is a
6.
small device.
I don't, I see no reason to keep
Okay.
one of those on site.
Well,
Unless Derek, you want to say otherwise, but, and I would
It's not-
suggest
it's not
talking
a-
to the fire department just to have that 6-foot minimum distance between the two.
well, so just a comment, so everybody knows what a trailer valet is. It's like a little robot. They're probably 3 feet by 3 feet big. They're flat, they're on little tank wheels, and they basically just have a ball that sticks up and it hooks up to the trailer and tows it with a remote. So they're not big. They literally you can pick them up with your hands.
Sounds
So,
good.
Yeah, so it's just a tiny little robot, basically.
Yeah,
It's the
okay,
tiniest
great.
little robot. They literally hook up to these tiny houses and move them around. And that way they can actually be maneuvered better than a vehicle can maneuver it. So that they can be put into spaces that you wouldn't be able to actually use a vehicle to
truck.
get into.
Yeah.
That's all it is. So it's really nothing
Yeah.
fancy. Like I said, it's literally a little robot that operates on a remote control.
Which is very different than what I was thinking. So thank you for
Yeah,
that clarification. But I'll still go with Jenna's thought on this. I don't want to wake up and have my house almost on fire and try to figure out where the robot is, attach it, move. I mean, I think
Sure.
that the 6 foot minimum
Okay,
for me.
we like that. That's great. And like I said, we'll actually do some research too and make sure that that is enough. I mean, we'll double check that
Sure.
and we'll make sure we add that section. Let's see. We don't have, so one of the things was that no open space or amenities have been established. So I think when we kind of look at it, you know, we looked at the RV code, and the RV code for RV parks also didn't really establish it. So that's why we haven't established it. Now, I think it is our hope to kind of establish something there. We're just not sure how to add it in and write it in a way that it'll remain flexible. You know, I think by the very nature of the limits that we have placed on the size restriction, like I said, this
Low density.
yeah, we're proposing a starting point here that's pretty low density. So you might have a 250 square foot tiny home and it's on a 1,500 or 2,000 square foot lot size space. So there's going to be a lot of open space. We're going to have plenty of space. You know, we've already laid out some test pilot examples. And so we understand that with the density that we're proposing, there's going to be a lot of room for open space on the site. So I think our question for you guys is, how do you want the code to look to kind of require that and yet be flexible?
I have a number of suggestions kind of to throw out there. The first is, I don't know if you've looked to the multifamily standards. There's some flexibility there where it's like a pick and choose. So if you have X number of units, you need X number of amenities from X number of categories. And then kind of a second, if there is a process to go through and be approved, understanding flexibility, it sounds like the flexibility that this is kind of going back to the previous discussion, that you want might be based on tenants, not on the park. So if somebody comes in wanting them to have their office space and whatnot, but if you do that and you don't have pad sites identified and you have a larger community, let's say, how would you address the emergency medical side of things? So so-and-so is having a heart attack or something along those lines. How do you get the EMS to the correct unit, to the correct home?
So I think, Jenna, I think I've got your question. It's good. And we kind of saw that. I think we are proposing that these have pad sites, but I think what we're saying is we don't think the layout should be like a specific square foot, like this site needs to be 20 by 30 and the next one needs to be 20 by 30 and the next one needs to be 20 by 30. I think we're good with an idea of like labeling specific sites
And
pads.
Yeah.
And I think we actually say that tiny home communities shall have individual, I think you guys recommended we get rid of the word distinctive pads for locating each tiny home within the community. So I think the idea is that when we would propose this use, we would say, hey, we're going to have these 26 pad sites. And I think that layout would be something, I think you're right. We would propose that it go through maybe design review.
Yeah.
So that it's reviewed, but we would have pads.
We're just saying at the design, maybe there's a flag lot in Garden City, maybe their frontage is, or it's just a little bit awkward of a lot. We're saying, okay, let's street activate it, but then it needs to return to design review based on how it could be orientated. And then design review can weigh in on how the pads could be placed. And then, yes, they'll have pads and labels.
Yeah.
But we, again, wanted that design flexibility so it's attractive and not
Well, yeah, and
shot
I
at.
think, like I said, when you kind of look at how an RV park is laid out, you know, one of my favorite little tiny home communities is like a little 6-unit tiny home community that's
Round.
in an
right?
RV park, and it's round.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's actually in an RV park that is pretty boring, but that one little community, you know, you'll see a lot of pictures. I think we included pictures in our presentation because they really didn't do specific sites. They kind of, the pads are predetermined, but the site itself, like the square foot area around it, isn't very predetermined.
It's creative.
And that allowance for some creativity, I think, is why people are maybe more attracted to tiny home communities than they are to RV parks. But I do believe the spaces will still be labeled so that
Sure.
if there is an emergency, you know.
And they won't be interchangeable, I guess, to Jenna's point. It's not like thereafter, people can just be like moving them in and out and like redesigning the sites, the communities themselves or anything.
Yeah.
It'll be,
Yeah.
once it's approved at its layout, it'll be,
Yeah.
It will not change.
Right. Let's
So
address.
real quick on number 4, you say shall provide 1 bicycle parking space for each tiny home pad. Can you reword that to where it's 1 bicycle parking per tiny home? I don't know that the way I read that is we would have to have a bicycle rack for at each home versus putting them together, maybe like 5 over here, 5 over there. So just
Perfect.
maybe the wording on that.
Okay, perfect. I think too, I mean, let's address some of the other, go back up, Derek. Let me make sure we addressed everything there.
I'm not in control, but
Oh.
it seems to be working.
You're not in control, but it seems to be working.
Yeah, I'm not the scroller.
Oh, I'm not sure. Is that Jenna?
Yeah, I'm scrolling.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Jenna. So maybe the next question we had, I can see it's on here about the on-site management. You know, I think one of our questions is really, you know, how does the city see these communities? And in the RV park, so again, and this was for a 3-acre RV park, the city required a manager on site 24 hours a day. When we look at what we're proposing, we think it's not transient. We're hoping the city will see that having this as a more long-term solution, whether that be they allow for 1 year, 2 years, or whether they just remain mobile and we don't make them move. We don't think, you know, in other words, if you have, we'll still have an on-site manager, but the on-site manager, if he wants to go to the grocery store, doesn't have to worry, because again, we're looking at this and saying, hey, this isn't a transient community. This is a community of homes that are really just staying put. Because these people live here, they work in Garden City, and it isn't operating in the way that an RV park is operating, where people are moving on and off every single day. And so, you know, I think we'd love to hear some comments on that, because I do think, one, we envision these tiny home communities as being much smaller than 3 acres. And I think that having a manager on a RV park site that only maybe has 10 little tiny houses seems kind of overkill to me, in terms of especially the way they're operating, especially as they're operating basically like a mobile home park, like a small mobile home park. And if, you know, and that's not to say that, you know, so I don't know if maybe you have some comments to that end.
Maybe staff does.
Yeah.
I had no idea. She just asked me to call.
What I've heard is that those locations that have on-site management tend to have fewer police calls, et cetera. Because where you have a group of individuals working or living together, you may have bad behavior that gets caught before it gets out of control. So, say you have someone coming back with disruptive behavior, if that's caught by an on-site manager and dealt with before it ends up becoming a police call. I've heard that tends to be better. I understand your point where if you have a small, just a couple of unit community, maybe that's not necessary. But if you have a 200 unit community, maybe there's a different situation, and I don't know where the line would be on that. But somebody might, if you look through all of the communities, and I'm not even talking just tiny home communities where you have groups of individuals living together. It could even be single dwelling units, but maybe in a more dense situation. There will be at times, I suspect, conflicts between the neighbors.
Sure.
My neighbors have conflict all the time, and they're and that's, yeah.
Well, and I think, so here's what I guess we're kind of leaning toward. I think we don't mind having an on-site manager.
Sure.
I think, the way RV parks generally operate is that one person who lives there gets a reduction in their rent. Like if you go to any RV park in Idaho, they have a manager on site because people are constantly checking in and out. That manager makes sure everybody pays.
Sure.
But it's not somebody who really works there. It's just somebody who's staying there for a certain amount of time for free.
Just to look out for the
Yeah.
place.
And so we get that that's possible, but I think even within those RV parks, like that manager is allowed to leave the site. Sometimes if you've been into an RV park, they have a self-pay little thing. And what we're talking about isn't even an RV park. It's a much more permanent situation. So I think even for a small one, like 10 units, we were happy having an on-site manager. I think just the requirement for that manager to be on site for 24 hours a day
that's a little awkward.
is,
And I think
that's the part that seems restrictive to us in a way that's maybe not reasonable.
Where is that? I don't see that suggestion.
So that's actually part of the city's RV code, which is kind of what we based our code off of.
Okay, but that's not a current comment in the staff report, correct? Or am I missing that?
That's not a staff comment. No, you're correct.
Okay, yes. So I hear what Jenah is saying.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I would agree necessarily. I don't know that there has to be an on-site manager as long as there's someone who is reachable.
Can we say there needs to be an on-site manager designated to the community and needs to have, what was the phone call? I like that. It needs to have a phone communication available.
Well, that's
And
what we
then
already kind of have. I guess the question is, how do we word it so that
like
there is an on-site presence? Because I think what Jenah wants is maybe that management has this on-site presence.
Sure.
And I think you're going in the right direction, Jason, with your example of RV parks. It's like someone's there, they're getting some benefit from the overall community for being there, whether that's a rent reduction or, whatever. And it speaks to the comments that are in the right-hand column. It's like, if there is someone there, it's not just someone that's reachable by phone, because I can be reachable by phone, 5 countries away. But if there's someone there, they're going to see all these things that they're, trash is piling up and people are getting in fist fights and stuff like that.
Sure.
So I think that it may not be like, I think there's someone that's reachable that can be accountable, but there's someone there that's going to be saying like, hey, mow your lawn, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think we're just, maybe I'm looking at this wrong, but we're creating, in my mind, we're creating a subdivision, and don't get tangled up in the legal term of that, but we're creating a community of single-family homes, and you can create a PUD with 30 units per acre, all sorts of creative, flexible, and we don't require an on-site manager for that. So why are we asking for it here?
Good question. Is there in multifamily at some point, there a number that says on-site management?
Multifamily does require, and I think it is on-site management.
I think it's over a certain unit count, Jenna, for
Yeah.
multifam.
Do we know what those, we'll check that out.
I wanna
Like
say it was
60 comes to my
50
mind, but I may just be.
for some reason.
I'm screen sharing.
Like, I think it's more than 20, but.
We will get the answer on the number in
Great.
just a second.
Oh,
Great.
perfect.
I mean, and again, I don't think we mind on-site present, phone communication, reachable by phone.
Yeah,
I don't think we, because again, especially as we try, but then again, on-site 24 hours, I also am like, look, this person needs to work and be gainfully employed in our community and not just standing around staring at people.
all right, right.
So,
And I don't think there's anywhere that it says that it should be that, to
Okay,
Maureen's
cool.
original point.
Well,
And I
well, I think, like I said, where we saw the on-site management originally is the RV code that requires a 24-hour on-site manager.
And I can see that, but that's the RV, and we're not
Yeah.
talking about that here.
good.
And
And we
maybe
just want to
where,
make sure that's
yeah.
clear. I mean, again.
And the multifamily code is 20 units or more.
20 units.
Okay,
Hey, so I mean, if we could put that in, I think anything over 20 is, you're
Sure.
right, there's more activity. What if there was only 6 on
Yeah.
a site?
sure.
So would everybody be okay to more than 20?
I
So
like
that-
tying new codes with some justification of old codes. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
me too.
I like that. Jenna, do you mind going? We kind of skipped down. I don't know if we want to.
You want to go back up?
Well, wherever we were, we can kind of pick up just to make sure we get any other. Let's see. Oh, yeah, this is the design review part of it. So we obviously, when we heard the last time, it was like, hey, maybe there should be some design review type stuff. So I think that's what we tried to do here in number
Oh.
8.
Gotcha.
If you look at number 8, that's kind of how we rewrote it. Now, I do think, I'm not sure the staff comment there, Jen, it says removing visibility from the street. I think we are saying we don't want to remove visibility from the street. So when we looked at the RV park code, it requires it to be screened on every single side, including the street,
Yeah.
which I think we thought was kind of dumb.
Well, we actually designed a couple prototypes, and then what we absolutely, after looking at it, probably that was one of the most unattractive, is having fences all the way around versus I really want the units to be very attractive and street activated.
Well, and I think people think tiny houses are cool. When we
I
had the
think-
tiny houses parked over here, we had a nonstop flow of people from push and pour stopping to look at them and wanting to see them. And so I actually don't,
definitely, oh, sorry.
yep, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I don't recommend looking at the RV requirements
Okay.
at all
Yeah.
for the majority of this. But what we do require for multifamily,
Yeah.
you guys know what we look at PUD. For me, this is creating a single family development, but it's a little different. So therefore, it comes through the design review committee because we wouldn't let us look at single family necessarily, a single family. So I would look at those requirements.
Perfect.
Well, so Maureen, a quick question for you. So our issue is let's say we're the tiny home park applicant. We come in, we say, here's our site layout. We have some sites that are going to be along the public right of way. Well, later now we've got people bringing in their tiny homes. And so I think the question we have is, okay, we as the park owner may look at these tiny homes and go, this tiny home looks really cool. That's the one we want to put right here out front. You know, so do we want to, does the city want to have a process where they go, yes, that's good. That tiny home
That's the street
is
one.
appropriate to be addressing the street. You know, again, because this gets complicated because the tiny homes technically can be moved at any time. And so I think there's an issue with the fact that no one's going to see what tiny homes are on the property until they're on the property or getting ready to be moved to the property. And so while I think when I look at almost every tiny home that's being built, they all look super cool. Not everybody might agree with that.
Sure. Well, and some have that door on the side and some have that door in the front.
I see what you're saying.
And I don't agree with it, Jason. And I think you would expect as much from me, but like there's tiny homes even in, within walking distance that some of them are cool and some of them look like a store more shed. And we want the really cool ones on the street. So you're right in saying, how does the city manage that? How does the city say these two that face the street have to be cool? And when that person's moved, you have to bring another cool one in, not a storm or shed.
And so I think in my mind, and this may be, the problem is I'm not sure how to even get this in code.
Yeah.
But let's say we came through, we have a site application, we have some sites that are clearly along the public right of way. So they're going to be, if tiny houses get placed, everybody knows you're going to see them from the street. Maybe those sites, when we want to place tiny homes on them, we do the permitting. So as part of our registration, we have pictures being taken of those tiny homes to register them.
Yeah.
So maybe there is some approval process where the ones that we want to place there, we have to send that to Jenah, and it's a quick look by the design review people to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, something to that extent. Now, how we would write that.
That's ideal, but it sounds really complicated too.
Yeah.
Well, right. And that's I think where we would need some help to try to think through how we would codify that. But to me, it's such a quick thing. I do feel like the design review committee could take 1 second and look at a tiny house and go, oh yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not like
part of
Well, I think that if you look at the non-commercial uses design requirements about the glazing, the fenestration, that kind of stuff, just incorporating that, not quite as much as that, but incorporating those things, and then that can be a staff, and if staff's not comfortable, they can bring it to design review.
I think I agree more than completely. I think you put those parameters of the non-commercial and then you say it's a staff decision. Again, I know staff's bombarded, but I think that's a good shot.
What we originally have written here, it says tiny home communities shall be screened from adjacent properties by a site obscuring planting, screen, fence, or a combination thereof, and shall meet all landscaping requirements. It says, where adjacent to the public right of way, tiny home community design and layout should address the street, and elevations of individual tiny homes should contain the following: windows, a variety of colors, modulation in the tiny home facade or roof line, and clear pedestrian connectivity into the site from the sidewalk. So I think we actually picked that out of that code that you're speaking to, Maureen.
Yeah. Take another look. There seems to be a few things missing. I apologize that I don't.
No, I think it's amazing.
Okay, and then I have this other question. You say it has to be screened from adjacent properties. Well, what if the adjacent property is a tiny home community? So I don't know that maybe not screening. Go look at how the requirements are for if you put multifamily next to, single family, there needs to be screening, or commercial next to residential. So more along those lines rather than just saying all tiny home communities have to be screened. Because I don't know that they do.
Yeah.
Yes, sometimes.
But when you look at the commercial or the non-residential I can't remember the name of the
Yeah.
darn section, but there's also requirements along the side as well.
Yeah.
So along your, you can't have a long blank wall.
Yeah.
So it's not just the public right of way that we're looking at here, but
Well, yeah. and I
it does
think
not
that
need to be
is-
a screen necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, again, we kind of took that from the RV code, which is why it seems so strict.
But I think now it's easy to say, maybe it's too loose, but today, or at the guidance of a design review committee. So that as a community comes in, right, it allows that, like, let's look through it if it's an odd shaped lot or something. I mean, again, it allows DR to talk through those actual layouts.
Well, and I mean, my assumption is like, so part of the reason the Garden City Code required complete screening of RV parks is because maybe no neighbor, no matter what their use is, wants to look at an RV. And so, I don't know, maybe neighbors don't want to look at tiny houses either. I don't know, it's hard to say. Maybe
Okay.
Jenna can weigh in too on that. Or maybe her thoughts.
I had a comment, this is Hannah, I had a comment about just the regulations of enforcing that street frontage presence. And I was just thinking that maybe there could be a provision in the initial design review that those front spaces have to have a front door being facing the street. Like you guys were saying, some of the homes have the front door on the side or a front door on what you could say is the other side of it. The front, and maybe just those particular spaces are oriented in a way to where it has only particular styled homes that can go in there.
Sure,
Yeah, I like that too.
I do too.
I mean, I
Which makes me
guess
think-
my bigger question is like, how do we get that reviewed?
Well, if we're gonna put a mechanism to bring all communities back through DR.
Well, but then you got to bring the homes themselves.
Oh,
through
sure,
DR.
sure.
And like I said, maybe we'll work on thinking of a way to do that. That's not,
Okay.
because again, I do believe that it's not something that needs a lot of review. It's just something where somebody needs to see the pictures and go, this is what's facing the street. Is everybody good with this?
Yeah.
Um,
And again, we could just say staff level, so that way if staff sees it and they're like, no, I don't like anything, it's going back through design review, like, I don't know.
yeah. Well, I mean, I would be comfortable with it being staff level.
Sure, and then if they don't like it, they can send it up.
But what if they just don't like it?
I
That's a
think
Jenna.
there's a current, I can't remember what it's for, but we have, I probably am using the wrong words here, relegated approval of certain things to staff. If they do not think it is meeting requirements, then they can bring it back to us.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
this,
Got it.
that's what I'm suggesting here is that unless staff has a problem with reviewing these tiny home photos.
I don't think we would.
Okay, cool,
Um,
so we'll put that verbiage.
So real quick, the water sewer question, we took that language from the RV park code, Jenna. So we can change it to whatever you guys want. Like I said, that's actually exactly the language of the RV park. So we just assumed that's who would approve it.
Unless it's a main line, you wouldn't need the city engineer to review it.
Gotcha.
You could get a plumbing permit, and it seems like
Okay.
that would be
Okay.
cheaper and
got it.
easier.
And what's the alternative? I mean, can you have one water bill with 7 pads? I mean, you're gonna need a water connection, but is this say
Sure.
a separate water utility, a separate water bill for each one?
Are you asking us, Derek?
Yeah. I mean,
No, I
would
think
you,
it would. I think more than likely it would operate the way most RV parks operate, where they
Gotcha.
just have a single.
One based on flow
Yeah,
though, so
yeah.
city will capture adequate billing through flow.
Yeah.
6 units has 6 water bills.
It has one water bill based on flow.
Oh,
Like I
gotcha,
said, it would
gotcha.
be like, it would be like
Yep.
an RV park site.
Yep. Okay.
You know, in that
It's
way, but yeah, so
sub-metered.
we took that language and we didn't realize, like, I guess we were thinking if the RV park needs to have this type of review, then maybe we do also. We also will change the trash stuff to that language.
Sure.
That's not a big problem for us. I think we'll also look like, so obviously when we went through, go all the way down, Jenna, to limitations, right? Yep, you're right there. So one of the things we heard from city council was, hey, we should allow RVs within the tiny home community. And so, you know, again, we still, in some way, I think we kind of think there are some RVs that are cool, like Airstream type stuff. And maybe at the same time, the flexibility of allowing an RV to stay on site is, you know, maybe still useful.
Sure.
You know, again, I don't know to what end the city council was looking at it from an affordability standpoint, you know, and I don't think this proposal is like a 100% affordable solution. It's just one piece of a big puzzle
Well,
of affordability.
This is an affordable package. Will this solve affordability across the board for everybody? No, because some families, as we experienced, a family of 4, this just might not be a solution for them.
Right.
But this, I mean, I think this is a naturally and organically affordable option that does have home ownership. But I think it's just that did we say it's a timeline or a percentage of RVs?
Well,
that
right
can
now
come
we
in?
have 15%.
Oh, gotcha.
And I think that's a pretty limiting number. So if you had 10 tiny home sites on a property, you could have 1 RV. You know, and in our mind, like I said, the city council is looking at it from an affordable side, but we also think that like having too many RVs takes away from the fact that it's a tiny home community and it's meant to be something different than an RV park. You know, and at the same time, like I said, it isn't meant to be a cure-all solution to affordability.
Yeah, and I hear where you're coming from. And speaking specifically to the, you know, you can see tiny home villages full of, you know, Airstreams and things like that, and they have a certain feel and a look to them, but then that's not the same look and feel you get from a, you know, 1972 Dolphin that, you know, has flat tires, right? So it's just this, it's less of a community. And so I look at that like if you have a 20 unit lot and the back 2 or 3 are broken down RVs, you know, with mold in the windows, it's like then that back neighbor has that presence up next to them rather than this tiny home community that you may have envisioned. So that's tricky. I don't know if I don't know what a good answer for that is.
Yeah,
but
yeah, it is tricky. Maureen, do you have any thoughts to that?
No, I mean, I think what you have written in there is appropriate. 15% has to be moved from the site every so often. I like staff's suggestion, maybe matching the RV park requirement of 90 days.
Okay.
And then I think they had some other really good comments that just need to be defined out a little bit more by you guys.
Sure. And I guess, you know, in our mind, you know, if we did allow RVs, you know, if let's say this was our tiny home community, if we allowed RVs, I think one of the arguments against the 90 days is that, again, it adds to kind of the, like, not only do I think having RVs kind of takes away from the community aspect, but then forcing them to move every 3 months
makes it transient.
Really creates that transience, which is kind of why RV parks aren't great. And so I kind of think, you know, in my mind, maybe having RVs with maybe even a longer term stay, like if you're going to allow 15%, so you might have 1 out of every 10 is this RV. So on your site, maybe you have a little Airstream that you felt like fits your community. You know, forcing that Airstream to move every 30 days definitely takes away from the fact that that person feels part of the community. Like while
And then-
all his neighbors are like, yeah, we're here for good.
Minus you.
Airstream, get out.
And is it legal to hook an RV to city utilities?
I think in this case it would be, because it'd be codified. So,
Because it'd
You
be,
know, right.
because it'd be in a pseudo RV park.
right. You know, so right now, the way the code reads, I think would be that it has to be in an RV park
Sure.
to be hooked up.
To utilities.
Yeah. And
I
we
also
can-
think that I heard the proposal earlier in the day to get rid of the timeframes potentially and just say that it needs to be roadworthy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that can apply here too, right, Jenna? That's what you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah,
And then are you guys comfortable just starting at 15% and leaving it there, or what's that thought?
I don't know that I, 10 to 15%, I'm not sure I would have an argument either way.
Okay. I think it's probably fine to start, and then again, if we're like, again, we'll bring it.
well, I think, like I said, the city council, as we talked about this, really was sticking on the affordability. And obviously, if we had a bunch of RVs, that would be more affordable for people, no doubt.
Well, they were
'Cause
saying that
tiny homes are
more
more
people
expensive.
could likely afford an RV than they could a tiny house.
Sure, sure. And so I think it's like this idea, but again, this isn't just the most affordable solution. It's just one possible piece of a puzzle. But
Well,
we don't
and
have to
maybe if-
solve it all right here.
And we already
Yeah.
allow RV parks, so,
Yeah.
which, that could be the next
Right,
amendment
that's what,
to the zoning
totally.
code.
Sure.
like if the
Okay.
RV code went to 1 acre or 2/3 of an acre, then there's a opportunity for affordable housing in RVs, if that's the will
Sure.
of the city council.
Sure.
Okay.
So maybe the tenant overstay stuff goes away anyway. We'll kind of look at how we want to do our timelines. So then maybe there's no need for penalties. But I do think there maybe we can talk about penalties, and this may be more of a question for Jenah and Hanna. But in terms of, because there's a bunch of things here that have to be abided by, not just this one section. And
Well,
so-
didn't we talk about just eliminating timelines on RVs altogether too?
Yeah. But even outside of that, I mean, like, what if somebody doesn't register when they're supposed to? What's the
Oh, right.
penalty?
Oh,
Right.
sure.
You know, so within this whole group of things. So I
I-
think, yeah, we're getting rid of timelines maybe, but
And I always think the infraction goes back to the landowner or community owner, because that's easier for the city to say, hey, property owner, you're in the hot seat because you didn't register your parties. You didn't have a process that.
well,
got them
so I
there.
kind of would like to hear from Jenah and
Okay.
Hanna on what they think is kind of appropriate for the penalties. So we kind of have something to start with.
Okay,
Well, there's a penalty section in code that pretty basically really defines whether it's an infraction or a misdemeanor. And so I guess I would start there where code already kind of defines things. It's not
Okay.
necessarily my favorite how it's set up, but it's set up that way.
Okay.
So are you
And
saying
then-
we could just reference that, Jenah?
I would suggest that you'd probably put the section of code where it's just a bunch of
Okay.
different sections of code, which is infraction or which is
Perfect.
misdemeanor.
So just
Um,
reference infraction.
And then I agree very much with with what Hannah just said, where the more that the community, the owner can administer, the better than the city administering it. The oversight really should be coming from self-regulations over having the city always having to go in and try to make sure that everything's compliant.
Sure. And I think that section of code, we actually took straight from the RV park section, which that's how it's worded.
Sure. Well, we can reference infraction and then do verbiage on property owner.
Yeah, yeah, so we'll kind of edit that so it's a little more community oriented.
Sure.
Let's see.
We went over
Yeah.
site maintenance.
So maybe the last one is the accessory dwelling unit. So there's a bunch here because I guess the city is also changing code. So I think this is maybe the most complicated little section because the city's in the process of changing the code. And Jenna, do you know if that code will be changed?
It's in the hopper. But I don't have a time frame. I would say anywhere from this going through the hearing process being 2 to 3 months out to further.
So the strike throughs are what cities already caught as kind of what they want to start heading towards modification anyhow.
So on the left-hand side, it's your proposal with the blue being your new proposal. And then on the right-hand side, it's the comments that staff identified.
Gotcha.
So I'm trying to see what. So it will change the habitable space. I think, like I said, some of it will fix. Some of it was just wording.
And are we making, so since we basically already kind of said it's a good idea for our communities, our tiny house communities to return to a design review and / staff process, are we saying that ADUs should do the same just for safety?
I would think so. I mean,
For safety reasons, I mean,
Well, not.
All-
I mean,
all
so that the
accessory-
City puts eyes on it.
well, I know, when we talked to some people over in Riverside Village, they had a neighbor that built an ADU that was just under the city size for having to get a permit. And the thing was like, it was like, I don't know, 18 feet tall. And so it's this giant structure, but the square footage was just small enough that it didn't have to go through any permitting. And so that stirred up a lot of angriness. So to me, like before somebody, now, of course, we are limited to the areas where there are just already trailer parks and also the C2 zone.
Sure.
So this couldn't be in Riverside Village.
Couldn't be in any established
Yeah, it
situation.
couldn't be in any of the established areas like that. But even in some areas, I could see somebody rolling a tiny house into their backyard without having gone through any process might be an issue for a neighbor. So I think there should be something there.
I think that any accessory unit, other than the one that was so small, it went underneath Garden City requirements, does have to meet setback requirements and all those other things according to the zoning district that it's in. What else are you, and I would suggest that if a tiny home is going to be used as an accessory unit, it still go through that same process, even though it's not being built on site. So
Right.
what else are you suggesting?
Well, I think we just want to make sure that everybody's good with the code we wrote for this, because, again, we're trying to make sure there's no problems in the code we wrote that we aren't seeing.
Yeah.
Because again, I don't want all of a sudden, because again, if a tiny house rolls into your neighbor's backyard and you didn't, whoa, what just happened? Then it creates some issues, and we want to try to avoid issues as best we can. So I guess the question is this where it would go through the normal ADU approval process? Is that enough of a standard to make everybody happy?
And you're saying when an individual unit comes into an already approved community?
They can't be in an HOA, but what if they're right up against the fence that borders the HOA?
Well, this accessory dwelling unit isn't for communities. It's a separate thing.
Right,
It's
right.
just a
Meaning-
single.
Yeah,
right?
meaning if you have
But
a
you're
house.
looking at it specifically because of when a new tiny home on wheels comes into one of your communities, you want it to be looked at under this ADU guideline?
No, because we wouldn't consider those ADUs. What we're
Gotcha,
saying is
gotcha.
if you have a
Yep, yep.
house, you could also have a tiny house as
You're
an
just
ADU.
You're just looking at this because it has to do with tiny homes. And
Right,
you're
right,
looking at, and
So
you're
this
looking
is
at.
really its own separate piece, meaning
Yeah,
you could, in theory, the city, if they wanted, they could adopt the tiny home community code separate, and this could be not
Right.
adopted
right.
if they don't feel like they want tiny homes as accessory dwelling units.
It's just while we're talking about tiny homes, let's clean this up.
Well, and we're saying maybe they should also be included.
Yeah,
Because, it may be that you don't want a whole community of tiny homes, but you may want to have an accessory dwelling unit in your backyard, so that your kids have a place to live.
Yeah.
Or your parents.
Yeah.
Because kids sounds lazy.
No, yeah.
Parents sound respectful.
I think it should be the same requirements as any mother-in-law suite, as an accessory dwelling unit.
I guess that's our question, maybe, we don't see, I don't know that when I watch like design review, that I see a bunch of ADUs coming through design review, because I assume those are like staff level decisions, maybe,
Yeah.
oftentimes.
Well, we've only seen
Is
one.
that
Yes,
correct,
they're
Jenna?
staff level. Yes, they're staff
Yeah,
level.
and so I guess the real question maybe is more for you, Jenna and Hannah. Do you feel like just adding the tiny home as some staff level decision, if that's appropriate?
I would agree that they do need to meet the setbacks, and still need to be certified, et cetera, for safety.
Okay,
And then you do have here that they need to be hooked up to water, sewer, and electrical services.
yep. And so I think the code already like if our additions would still mean they would still meet all the setbacks and that stuff already. Yeah, because that's already part of that code is the setbacks. It says setbacks shall meet the zoning district setback requirements. So our additions would still be good for all that, I assume.
And then if you'd like, I can hit the link so you can see what Planning and Zoning Commission proposed,
Oh, yeah, sure.
maybe.
Did they just go
So
to,
everybody can see it.
they just said for the ADU section? Or they
Yeah.
just,
This is.
oh,
the-
really?
So, it wouldn't be allowed in front of the principal structure, and then. That's
So
it.
Yeah.
need to be on the side or to the rear?
I mean, I think the only thing that was an issue for us was the 300 square feet.
Open space?
No, in that code, that the new code that's being proposed says the units will be 300 square feet. And obviously tiny houses,
Sure.
half of your tiny houses would be out.
We could trigger 150 because the standard, like some of the Reva certified original A-frame Acorn designs were 150, max 200. So you're right, that would really kind of kick a
Well,
lot of the neat ones, especially if you just have a single parent.
So Jenna, obviously that this has already been looked at by planning and zoning, right? And this is the recommended changes.
Correct.
And so, it says the unit will have at least 300 square feet of habitable space. how do you feel like that interacts with our tiny homes? Can we have a separate piece that says tiny homes could be 120, or do you think we should propose that that 300 be changed?
Yeah, I would say just make that 120 or make that the minimum. Don't say 300 square feet, or unless it's a tiny home, it can be this. Just change that to be a smaller number, be my gut
Okay.
reaction. But you were asking Jenna, so I'll let her answer.
Well, yeah, and I don't know what the original reason for that 300 square feet is.
I'm wondering if it came out of the building code initially.
I think
Well,
so.
because even in building code, I know you can, right now in residential building code, you can have units as small as 70 square feet.
But that changed.
And in international
That was-
building code, it's 120.
That was after Garden City adopted this. I believe so.
Well, this isn't adopted yet. They haven't
Oh, I
adopted
thought
this.
that we had.
The black is adopted.
No, this isn't adopted. So,
Okay,
so I know that IRC is.
No,
70
Jason,
square
the
feet.
300 is adopted. I think you didn't hear Jenna. She just said everything
Oh,
that's
oh, it
in
is
black is
adopted.
under
current.
ADU currently.
Yeah. So I guess what we're saying is I do think that the IBC allows units as small as 120 square feet, even built on foundation.
Yeah, and I think that's a, you don't have to convince me that you can live in 120 square feet. We have to convince city council. So if they're looking at affordability and, wanting to push that, obviously 120 square foot home is cheaper than a 300 square foot home. So I think that
Sure.
that argument could be made.
Okay.
And then before we scroll off there, let's look at number 9, if we've wrapped up number 5. Oh, no, it was on that page. Yeah, there must be one.
Not on the other.
There must be one on-site parking space provided. The principal structure must also be code compliant. To me, that means if it's a single family residence, it may have to have 2. Are we saying now there's an additional 1, so we need 3?
That is what that says, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, and I think we're okay with that. I don't think we have a problem. Obviously where these might be parked, especially like I said, we're allowing this in C2 and R3. I think where it might get parked, where there's already a house, there's probably other houses around, and you obviously, the less issues you create to adjoining properties, the better, the safer
Yeah.
it is.
yeah,
At least initially. Maybe later we look at it and go, this parking is ridiculous. We have a 330 square foot space for the car to park in and then pull out of
right, which is
for a house.
maybe
that's
where,
only 200
maybe
square
where I
feet.
was going is, the parking, the additional parking for an ADU is often a problem in, dense neighborhoods like the North End and the East End, and the city of Boise has been removing it from their code. They had for years been waiving that extra one. And now I think they've codified to remove it and not requiring that in their latest update. So I was just thinking ahead to this being a problem, and are we creating a problem now that in the future we're going to want to remove?
Well, I think
Yeah,
you're right.
I would be in
Probably.
favor of not having number 9.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that's something new that the city is about to adopt. Is that correct, Jenna? Number 9?
I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think this committee's seen it at all. So it hasn't gone through the
Oh.
neighborhood meeting. It hasn't
Oh,
gone through
gotcha.
work sessions.
But that is
This is a
current
proposal by the Planning and Zoning Commission at this point.
Got it.
But just for ADU, just for the section ADU code, right,
Right.
Jenna? Okay.
But so, I mean, it seems to me like if the city is just now proposing to add one on-site parking space, the city's
like
moving in the
it.
opposite direction of what we're all saying we
Yep.
think is the future.
Yep.
Well,
Uh,
the city is not suggesting anything. The planning and zoning has
Yeah.
added this as a potential
Yeah.
Correct.
criteria that will be under review. So, and
Yeah,
it'll come to us, and then at least Derek and I are gonna be like, well, I don't think we need to require parking. But then whatever we say, whatever planning and zoning says, and of course, staff has to analyze everything. Then city council
Yeah.
will make a decision.
Yeah.
And Jenna or Hannah, these blue comments are from a planning and zoning work session, right? It's not like their final take on it. It's just part of their process like we're going through now, right?
Correct. So code amendments can be initiated by this committee or, this was one that Planning and Zoning Commission thought that there was a miss in Garden City's code, and this was the recommendation. But that
Okay.
doesn't mean that it won't go back to them and they don't change their mind for their formal recommendation.
Okay.
It was just, can we look at it and suggest some changes to go through the process?
Thanks.
So I think we'll obviously be beholden to whatever gets decided in this. Because like I said, whether we end up with the parking or not the parking, I think we're just gonna have to have whatever it is.
Sure.
It's not really our decision. So I think we've gotten a lot here.
Yeah,
We've
sure.
got a
We
lot
got
of
a lot of
notes here.
notes.
So Jenna, what is the next step? I mean, I know it goes to planning and zoning and they provide comments. Will it come back to us, or is this like, I think we've provided, I'm sure there could be additional questions, but I think we've provided enough information to move forward. But I'm not sure what the actual correct next steps are.
Provided that everybody feels that it's okay to move forward as it moves through this round of work sessions. So in the last round of work sessions, I think all of the deciding bodies indicated that it would be good to see it again as a secondary work session. But then from there, it would go into the public hearing. So you will see it one more time. This isn't your final recommendation. You'll see it for a public hearing.
Cool.
Sounds good. Thank you.
And I have one other question just to kind of back up and look at worst case scenario is, I know Jason and Hannah, you're creative people, and I can kind of pick up on the intention of where you're going with this. But in this code, 2 years from now, some developer says, I'm going to make a tiny house village. What's to prevent him or encourage him? What's to prevent him from just making a tiny house village that looks like the bad RV park or the bad mobile home park that we have, that you guys in your intentions, I think, are trying to avoid?
I would say that mechanism very much is designing something that has a certain amount of amenities, open space, quality design, and then having it go back through the DR process.
When I think
In a
too,
nutshell,
part of
I
it
would
is maybe
say-
our design
Sure, but how do we
definition
know?
of tiny homes
Yeah,
to eliminate the possibility of RVs being there.
Right.
That doesn't mean you still couldn't get ugly tiny homes, but
Right.
maybe we can at least regulate the ugly tiny homes that would be visible.
Right.
And I think Derek is really trying to make sure that when you're going through and making all of these changes, that you're paying attention to, like Hannah was saying, we're going to have a minimum open space requirement. We're going to have the requirements along the public street. Just really think about that so that you're putting in those, flexible, but putting in those requirements so we don't get that bad
Yeah.
RV park.
Because an easy answer is to dig a trench down one side and put your utilities in, and dig a trench down the other and put your utilities in, and stack up a bunch of, herringbone trailers with a driveway down the
Sure.
middle, and,
Sure.
take your
And
your money and run.
the one thing I think that this body and that I've seen is and it's so interesting, but I think the difference in good design versus just naturally bad design is what did they do with their amenities and their open space? Did they think of that, and did they make those amenities? Did they really design first with those in mind, or was that an after to be like, we didn't have any amenities, what are you talking about? And that's what I've seen is when developments come in and we're like, hey, you did not meet amenities and open space, we quickly look at it and say, it's not attractive. And because you didn't design for the person in mind who's going to be here, you simply did your units. And so, of course, I think amenities and open space, and you can, again, returning that to the design review body, so that they can look and say, you did it. And this is a creative manner, but it's also quality for the person living there. It's a quality of life that encourages community.
Well, we will look at the multifamily amenities
Yeah.
so that we can kind of pull that section of code. And I think, like I said, we're going to have open space because we've got a pretty low density initially here, to kind of make sure there's plenty of open space. So it's going to feel less clustered just by the very nature of the density.
And open
Yeah.
and, single level. I like all these features, I can really envision this. And I think I do believe that this is tight enough code that it becomes, you have to have an attractive product or DR will catch it. We didn't talk about outdoor storage in general. I'm not a huge fan of outdoor storage in any capacity.
Yeah, we kind of got conflicting stuff. So when we went to planning and zoning, some of those commissioners were like, where are people going to store all their stuff? And shouldn't you have some storage space? But I think it's our take that people who want to be minimalist maybe are moving the other direction than people who can't visualize being minimalist.
Well, and I'm seeing as in Garden City and throughout the communities that there's one tough shed and then two tough sheds and 3 outbuildings per lot. And then before you know it, you're building roofs between the outbuildings to store additional things. And it's like, if you have 5 outbuildings, you maybe need to look at the amount of stuff you accumulate. Outbuildings can become visually distracting from garden and green space. That's just my personal perspective. So I'm not a fan of outdoor storage, because the reality is when I look at a site, if there's so much stuff, as we said, they need to rent a storage unit.
Which goes against the affordability. Minimalist, I get it, but your minimalist is still gonna want a kayak, still gonna want a mountain bike.
Yep.
Still just try to consider how you might accommodate outdoor storage appropriately for this kind of thing. And it may not be something that's anywhere in the current code for other things. It might be something that you come up with that's completely unique to the tiny home community.
And I think you're right. I think that's really looking at those community amenities and saying, could like indoor bicycle storage. There's really, it does bring up that really in-depth minimalist conversation that we want to make sure it's very practical and above and beyond so that we maintain our appearance.
Cool.
I think that's it. Well, thank you guys. Unless anybody has any additional thoughts, staff, thank you guys. I know that looking into the layers of code, since code is already getting reworked and pulling the sections out and applying them to 2 layers of new code is quite a challenge.
Yeah.
3 layers.
Yeah, thank you very much. We got a lot to work with, so
Yeah.
we appreciate it.
Yeah, very helpful.
Well, thank you, everybody. It sounds like we're wrapping up and appreciate everyone's time. And
Jenah, I know this is recorded. Is that correct?
this is recorded.
Is that going to be on YouTube? I know you put some of them up.
It should go on the YouTube, yes.
Perfect. Thank you. We're just checking just to be sure that we'll be able to
Clean notes.
go back through, because sometimes it does help just re-listening.
Some affiliate marketing links.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
And any other discussion from the committee?
I don't think so.
All right, we might actually get Maureen to her other meeting on time.
Nice.
Thank you. We can adjourn at 4:59.
Sounds good. Bye.
Okay.